at UbiOps, we just released amazing new functionality that I'm very excited to tell you about because it really expands the possibilities of what you can do with pipelines inside UbiOps. So let me tell you what we added in release 2.20. So what we added are operators. Operators are something we added to the pipeline functionality. Up until now, it was always possible to use any deployment that you made inside your pipeline. But when we go to the pipeline editor now, you can see that we have two tabs, deployment and operators. Operators are pre-made functionality that we made for you to help you build more complex pipelines and to be able to do many more things that weren't possible before in a much more efficient way. We added 6 to begin with, so in this video I will give you a rundown of what operators we have, how they work, and how you can add them to your pipeline. So let's dive in. I've already opened up a pipeline editor right here, and I will just show each and every one of them and how to work with them with a dummy example. So let's say I first add one dummy deployment to start things off with, which is this dummy 4. This one doesn't do anything different than just returning the input, but it's just so that we can see what we can actually do with it. Okay, so we've got that added. That's just a regular deployment. We can attach it to pipeline start like you're used to so far, and I'll just map the inputs. Okay, so we've got that one going now. Let's add some operators. Let's start with the top one, which is the conditional logic operator. When I drag this one into the screen, you can see that there's a form that automatically pops up with a couple of settings that you can use. Because what the conditional logic operator does is it allows you to have some kind of conditional logic in your pipeline. So you can evaluate an expression that will dictate whether that path in the pipeline should continue or not. This can be helpful when you have certain models that are dependent on certain input criteria, and you first want to evaluate if those input criteria are actually met before forwarding it to the rest of your pipeline. So let's look at an example. I've got this number returning deployment. So let's say if that number is lower than 18, maybe it's an age, then I want to do something. So maybe then I want to stop my pipeline. So I just write this expression, numbers smaller than 18, and you can see that I used a variable in this expression. So to be able to use that variable, I also still need to define that in the expression variable section of this form. So I'm just going to say I have an input variable called number of type integer. And then when you look here, you can see that we've got this little test expression section, which actually allows you to test if your expression works correctly, which can be handy when you have more complicated expressions than this one, but we can still quickly test it. So if I input 15, that's smaller than 18. So when I click test expression, you can see that the expression evaluates to true. And when I enter like 25, it will evaluate to false. So this is how the conditional logic operator works. To add it in. So if you now hit save, it's added to our pipeline diagram, and now it's ready to be connected to the rest of your pipeline. So let's connect it to our dummy deployment. Quickly do the mapping. So we've got this one now, and if it evaluates to true, it will continue. If it evaluates to false, it will stop. So let's say I want to raise an error if this number is smaller than 18. So then I can add in this raise error operator. Raise error operator does exactly what it says. It just raises an error of your choosing. So now you can see the form again where we can fill in the configuration. The only thing you need to configure is what error message to throw when this raise error operator is triggered. So let's say number is lower than 18. So that's our error message. If I now hit save, we can connect this to this conditional logic operator. So if I connect these two together and click confirm, now what will happen is that if our conditional logic operator evaluates to true, in that case, our raise error operator will be triggered and our pipeline will be stopped with our error, which we can see here, number is lower than 18. So that will stop the entire pipeline with that error. If our condition, however, evaluates to false, then this won't happen and the pipeline will just continue as it should. So we can actually make that branch as well. So in case the number is over 18, then we can add another conditional logic for number is bigger or equal to 18. And again, give the number input variable. And we can also connect that one now to the dummy so that we have a different path to our pipeline. So this means that we have two potential paths. Either the condition of it being lower than 18 evaluates to true, or it being higher than or equal than 18 will evaluate to true. And if that's the case, maybe we want to use something called a function on it. So our function operator, drag it in. Our function operator allows you to do a simple Python function on any of your inputs to modify them. This can, for instance, be handy when you want to switch units, or you want to switch from centimeters to meters, for instance, something along those lines, and you can quickly pass it in your pipeline without needing to alter it in your deployment code. Again, we fill in our expression variables, which works exactly the same as with the conditional logic. So again, I have just a number of type integer. And also here we have a test expression section where we can test our expression to see if it works correctly. And the only difference with the conditional logic operator in terms of settings that you can tweak is the fact that you can change the data type of the output of this operator. So this operator will always have one output field called output, but you can change the data type of that. So that could be a Boolean or a string or a double. In this case, I'll stick to integer, but you can pick other ones if you like. Now, if I hit save, that one's also added to our pipeline. And if we now want to connect it, I will need to connect it to our dummy. So we say the output of our dummy deployment is the input of our function, but we also need to have an additional source, which I can do in this source objects dropdown. There I can add the if condition that I need, which will make sure that only if that if condition evaluates to true, then actually this path of the pipeline will happen. Otherwise, it just won't trigger. So, there we go. So now we can actually also see this branch of our pipeline. And what now will happen is we evaluate both expressions, and depending on which is true, we continue in one branch or the other branch of the pipeline. And then we can just add the output of the function to the pipeline end, and then we've got a working, functioning pipeline that you can work with. So these are the three kind of more basic or independent operators that you can use. Now, we've got three more operators, which you can see here on the left, which are the create subrequests, collect subrequests, and count subrequests. As the names already indicate, they are very related to one another, and they are typically used together. So I'm going to switch to a different pipeline to show you that properly. Okay, then I will go to another one, which is this video processing pipeline. So if I go here and enter edit mode, you can see that I actually already built it for you, just to give you an overview of what you can do with this. Because this create subrequests operator and these collect subrequests operator, they actually work together to parallelize a certain part of your pipeline. So the create subrequest will split off your requests into many sub ones, which can all be processed in parallel by the next objects in the pipeline. Up until the moment that there's a collect subrequest operator, which will collect all these subrequests into one big list again, that it can continue unparallelized. This is very helpful in the case you have a certain deployment that is actually very repetitive and that needs to be used for a lot of parts of the input. For instance, if you have a video processing pipeline. Let's say you have a video where every frame needs to be analyzed by a model from you before compiling that video back together. That's basically what I made here. So you can see that my first object in the pipeline is a video splitter. This object splits a video into individual frames, and these frames are then passed on to this frame processor deployment that will actually process every single frame in parallel. And this is, of course, a lot handier to do in parallel because it's a lot faster than if you do it sequentially. But to be able to do that in parallel, we need the create subrequests operator. So I will shortly delete it and show you how you can actually edit it. So I got my create subrequest here in the left sidebar. I can drag it in. And then you can see that I need to indicate what the source object is of this create subrequest operator, because the create subrequest operator is highly dependent on which source it needs to split. So in our case, our source object is the video splitter. And we've got a batch size which can, with which you can control how big the batches are. So if you really want to parallelize everything, or if you maybe want to parallelize in terms of batches of like 100 frames at a time. Okay. So if we hit save, that one's added now. And now I can connect it to our frame processor and just do the mapping like we're used to. And that's actually all there is to it in terms of adding it to your diagram. But there's one key thing that you shouldn't forget when you want to use the create subrequest operator. And that's that it needs a small change in the deployment code of your source object of the create subrequest. So I'm going to show you the source code of this video splitter object. Here I've got the deployment.py of my video splitter deployment. And what you can see is that I return splitted frames. And this splitted frames, that is a list of dictionaries. So typically when you have a deployment, you return only one dictionary with your output field name and the output, right? But this time we actually make a list of dictionaries which contain the frames that need to be processed. So here on this line, you can see that I append this list with each frame that's split off from the video. And then in the return statement, I return this list as opposed to a single item. So that's important because by returning this list, the create subrequest operator will be able to split that list into separate dictionaries to be processed by the next deployment. Okay, and then we can switch back. So that's the create subrequest operator. Now we've got the collect subrequest operator as well. So that one stops the parallelization of the pipeline. In our case, we need that because we want to go back from individual frames to a compiled video. And to be able to compile that video, we need to have access to all the frames at once. That's what the collect subrequests operator will help us do. So I'll shortly delete that and add that back in. So I added. For this one, I only need to select the destination object. So to what object do I need to send this list, this aggregated list? In our case, that's the video compiler object. So if I now hit save, that one's added in, and I can connect it to my frame processor. Map it, and there we go. Now for this one, there's also a little catch to be able to properly use this operator in combination with our destination object, because it needs a small tweak in the code as well. So when we go to the source code of the video compiler, which I have here, so this is my deployment.py of that object, you can see that instead of the request function that you typically use, I have a requests function with an additional s at the end. What UbiOps will do in case it notes that you have this requests function instead of your typical request function is that instead of passing one data dictionary as your data, we will actually pass a list of data dictionaries over which you can iterate so that you have access to all these frames at once. And that's actually what you can see what I'm doing here. So I'm iterating over all the items in that data list to get every single processed frame and put that in a list. And then I can just continue as usual. Return statement also nothing changes. So the only change is that I've got a requests function. And because of that, I've got a list of data instead of one data dictionary. Okay. I only have one operator that I haven't touched upon yet, which is the count subrequest operator. This one allows you to count how many subrequests are active at what point in your pipeline. I can add that in. And there's no mapping to do there, no additional settings that we need. It will just count everything there. And I can leave that in. So if I now hit save, we have a pipeline where I have a parallelized processing part for our video. And we can also keep track of how many frames there actually are in case we need that for debugging or sorting out the video properly. That's how it looks. I can also show you how that looks when we actually make a request to that then. So here we see our first object in the pipeline, which is the video splitter. And you can see that we have one video as input, but instead of one frame as output, we now have all these frames here as outputs, which we can browse through and we can download to check what is actually going on there. And they're each passed on to the frame processor. So also when we open up the dialog for the frame processor and to check what actually happened there, we can see that every frame was passed individually, and that we can see the results for each. And then in the video compiler one, we just put all of those back together to have one video as output. And that's actually it. Those are all the operators that we have at the moment. I hope this clarified a bit how you can actually work with them and what kind of things you can tweak. If you have any questions or if you're stuck, please just don't hesitate to reach out to us, send us an email, join us on Slack, and get in touch with us, and we're more than happy to help you out.